Welcome and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Danny Schultz, and I'll be your moderator today for the Israel Connection, our first in a series of monthly Israel-related talks hosted by the Westchester Jewish Council. Some of you may know, but for those of you who don't, the Westchester Jewish Council, or the WJC, is an umbrella organization representing 135 Jewish organizations, schools, and synagogues in the Westchester area, covering a Jewish community totaling 150,000 citizens, the 8th largest in the United States. Today, the council represents members with a very wide range of religious and political leanings, all of whom are united and unified in their support of Israel. I'm proud to be a board member of WJC, and I'm also on our organization's Israel Affairs Committee, so I'm honored to be introducing to you today Herb Block, our first guest in this series. After Herb's talk, I will pose a few questions myself, and then we will take questions from you, our studio audience. Please use your chat window on Zoom for that purpose to let us know if you have a question, and we'll go from there. One last thing before we begin, sorry, Herb. I wanted to encourage all of you to think about your most memorable or favorite Zionist or Israel experience. So in addition to questions, please ask questions. If you'd like, also share some of that with us if you're so inclined. Herbert Block has been the executive director of the American Zionist Movement since March 9, 2017. He has been an assistant executive vice president of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, with a particular focus on Jewish property restitution, and a presidential appointed member of the U.S. Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad. Previously, Herb served as assistant director for intergovernmental and public affairs for the New York City Independent Budget Office, assistant to the mayor of New York City, and a special assistant to the Manhattan Borough president before that. He is also the mayor's representative on the board of the New York City Museum of Jewish Heritage. Mr. Block received his BA from Columbia University and a JD from Brooklyn Law School. He joins us today from Israel, just having, quote, returned, whatever that means these days, from the 38th World Zionist Congress, first held 123 years ago in Basel, Switzerland. Take it away, Herb.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you to the team at the Westchester Jewish Council for inviting me to lead off this series. Let me tell you a little bit about the American Zionist Movement, which is pleased to have joined the WJC last year. I'm joined here on the program by two of my colleagues, Alicia Post, our program director, and Jeff Becker, our election coordinator. So the AZM is an organization that has been around with different names as the umbrella organization of the Zionist groups in America for over 80 years, known since 1993 as the American Zionist Movement, now comprised of 33 national Jewish Zionist organizations. And we work across like the Westchester Council, a very broad ideological, political, and religious spectrum of the community, linking the American Jewish community together in support of Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people. So we are essentially also an umbrella organization of Zionist groups in America, and we are the Zionist Federation within the World Zionist Organization. I'll talk a little bit more about what these different acronyms and bodies mean. And I was pleased to be asked to speak at this group and explain a little bit about the historic World Zionist Congress that met last week and got a good deal of attention for those who followed, especially the Jewish media. And I'll try to give a little bit of background and explain what happened. So my background here is a virtual background of the Binyanei HaUmah, which many may be familiar with if you've been in Jerusalem, as the Israel Convention Center, which was built to host the Zionist Congresses when they moved from being held in Europe to Israel after the formation of the State of Israel. So I'm going to ask Lori to go through the slides on the presentation, and I'll explain a little bit about the Zionist Congress, which people may have some familiarity with, which as it's loading, as Danny mentioned, the Zionist Congress began in 1897, convened first by Theodor Herzl. And this Zionist Congress that met last week was the 38th World Zionist Congress, but it's the first virtual Zionist Congress to be held. Can everyone see it on the screen? Is the screen up? Okay, here we go. Okay, so the first Zionist Congress was held in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland, and you'll see a portrait of the room in Basel. And on the right is the iconic photo of Theodor Herzl, the founder of the modern Zionist movement, from his hotel room in Basel. And Herzl convened the first gathering of, the Zionist movement had some early roots, but convened really the first major worldwide significant gathering of Zionists in 1897. It's where he made his famous statement that, some may laugh at what we did today, but in 5 years, surely 50 years, the dream will become a reality. I'm paraphrasing. And as we know, in almost 50 years later, in 1947, actually, exactly 50 years later, was the partition vote, and in 1948, the formation of the State of Israel. So the Zionist Congress met from 1897 till after the war in Europe. In the early days, people did wear tuxedos or even morning coats and formal wear. Herzl, it's a little known anecdote, but Herzl wanted people to feel that they were coming to an important and significant gathering, and the Jewish people were proud. They weren't just, the people photographed in rags in Eastern Europe, and they were proud Jewish people seeking a homeland of their own, as other nations have, and convened a formal in Basel in 1897. So let's move on. The Zionist Congress, Laurie, next. The Zionist Congress continues to meet. As I said, it was the 38th Zionist Congress that met last week. This is what is unique, and is that the first Zionist Congress to be virtual. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. I'll just keep going on the presentation. So it was the first the first virtual Zionist Congress because of the global pandemic. The Zionist Congress, which usually convenes people of from 35 countries around the world, had to meet only virtually, headquartered with a team running the virtual operation in the Binyan HaUmah, but meeting virtually with people from around the world, connected through a web platform as well as Zoom. So what came out of the Zionist Congress that Herzl formed? There are a number of bodies that were created that still exist today. The World Zionist Organization, which I'll talk more about in a minute, was the main organizational effort established by Herzl in 1897 in Basel as the body to push for the formation of the State of Israel. To finance the effort, there was something called the Jewish Colonial Trust, which then became Bank Leumi. There was the Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael, the KKL, known as the Jewish National Fund, established in 1901, also in a Congress led by Herzl. Herzl led the Congresses until he died in 1904 at a very early age. Keren Kayemet bought up and developed the land of the State of Israel and still does that today. The Keren HaYesod, very well known around the world, but not in America, is the global fundraising arm for the Zionist movement in every country except the United States. In the United States, that's done through the federation system, through the United Israel Appeal, which is today part of the Jewish Federations of North America. And lastly, the Jewish Agency for Israel, the Sochnut Jaffe, which was established in 1929, sort of as the government in exile of the Jewish people, and running programs and services for the Jewish community in the Yishuv, in the mandatory British mandatory Palestine. So the Zionist institutions today are the four of the five here: the World Zionist Organization, the Keren Kayemet, the Keren HaYesod, and the Jewish Agency. So if we can move to the next slide, the Zionist Congress is like let's say it's something akin to a political convention that we might be familiar with, like the Democratic Convention or the Republican Convention in America. You have elected delegates, 753 delegates altogether, 521 elected, selected through elections or by the leadership of Zionist federations around the world. As I mentioned, the AZM is the Zionist Federation in America, and we're we'll get to that in a second, the division of delegates around the world. In many countries where there's a small Zionist federation, there's just a meeting to elect their delegates. In America, we actually had an election. Many of you may have voted. There were thousands of people in Westchester who voted in something called the Zionist election that was held over a 7-week period from the end of January until the day after Purim. Luckily, we ended it just as the COVID crisis was gripping the country. There were 123,000 American Jews who voted in the World Zionist Congress election in the United States, which is more than a double the number that voted in the prior Zionist election in 2015, and the largest vote in about 30 years since the process was opened up to the American Jewish population. So it's a significant number of people who participated and paid a small fee to register and vote and participate in this election. And there were 15 different parties, slates that ran, which is the greatest number ever. So we were very happy with the increased participation and involvement of American Jews in preparing for the Zionist Congress. There are also designated delegates who represent international Zionist organizations, as you'll see on the screen. And these are Zionist organizations well known to many, such as Hadassah, Emunah, Na'amat, B'nai B'rith, that are really nonpartisan, that are humanitarian, educational, healthcare groups that have been long established parts of the Zionist movement. And they have delegates to the Zionist movement, but they don't represent the religious, the political arms, as it were, of the ideological parts of the Zionist movement. So these comprise the delegates of the Zionist Congress. Next screen. The elected delegates come from around the world, 200 of them representing Israel, and they're based on the same percentage of the Zionist parties in the Knesset. Zionist parties meaning the parties that declare themselves to be Zionist in the Knesset. There's 100 delegates. Out of the 120 members of the Knesset, it does not include the Arab parties or the Haredi parties that do not consider themselves to be a Zionist. So for every seat that a party has in the Knesset, they get 2 delegates to the Zionist Congress. 152 delegates, roughly a third of the world, from the United States, as elected through the election I just mentioned, and 169 from around the world. So the American delegation, including many from America in the organizations that I mentioned before, is the largest country group at the Zionist Congress. Next, so there are many groups. I'll just go through this quickly, and I'm happy to send anyone the slides after. And I think they may be on our website as well. We have a page on our website, azm.org/38WZC, that has a lot of information for the public about the Zionist Congress and has this presentation there as well. So there are many groups that represent the Reform movement, conservative, Orthodox movement, ideological groups such as Likud, which is represented by the ZOA in America, Cheirut, the labor Zionists, the Meretz, which and others that participate in the Zionist Congress and have strong ideological or religious viewpoints. Next. Then we have the world organizations, as I mentioned before, and these are sort of the nonpartisan groups, though some of them are affiliated with religious streams that are also part of the Zionist movement, and they also participate in the Zionist Congress. And then if this seems, we can move on to the next screen. the Zionist federations, as I mentioned, they exist in 34 countries around the world. There were just 2 new ones added on Sunday after the Zionist Congress in Ecuador and Paraguay. There are a couple of other countries, such as Uganda, that are applying. So the number of countries that have a Zionist federation is growing, which is a good thing for the continuation of the Zionist movement. So, when many people ask, didn't the Zionist movement really end when Herzl's dream of founding the Jewish state happened in 1948? And the Zionist movement, as we see it, and the WZO sees it, is not just, and Herzl himself saw it, is not just about forming the state of Israel, but it's about connecting the Jewish people around the world with the land and people of Israel. And that's one of the roles of the Zionist federations, to connect world Jewry to the state of Israel. And also the Zionist movement's goal is what Herzl called the Chavra Mofet, to perfect the society, to make Israel an exemplary society that we as a Jewish people can be proud of. So there's an element of that in continuing the work of the Zionist movement. Next. And then this is just getting really in the weeds, and you'll better be able to see it on the presentation on our website. But there's a whole structure of the Zionist institutions that operate different departments, including working with the diaspora, education, countering anti-Semitism. The WZO operates Mount Herzl, which is Herzl's grave, and also the military cemetery, and works to fund and promote Zionist activities and programs around the world. And the shlichim that go to America and many other countries, both from the WZO and through the Jewish Agency, that come through the funding of the WZO for communities and summer camps, including obviously a connection with the shlichim that you have here in Westchester. Next. And then out of the Zionist Congress, and I'll talk a little bit more after the slides about what happened last week, come the leadership of the WZO and the representation of the Zionist movement in the Jewish Agency, the Karen Kayemet, the Jewish National Fund, and the Karen HaYesod, which is the fundraising arm. So the concept was that the grassroots World Zionist movement would elect representatives to be as part of these organizations. And these national institutions, as they're called up there, function out of what's called the National Institutions Building. So many of you have seen the building on King George Street, the iconic picture of people dancing on partition night in front of the Jewish Agency building. That's the National Institutions Building. That's the hub of Zionist activities from around the world based in Israel. And these institutions function somewhat like a quasi-governmental structure. The state of Israel is a sovereign state, and there are certain things that a sovereign nation can do and cannot do, and certain things that would be better function, since the state of Israel includes all its residents, that the Zionist movement and the national institutions do in terms of Aliyah and Jewish education and Zionist education for the Jewish communities around the world. So that's why we still have a structure of the Zionist movement. And many of the activities, whether it's Masa programs or Birthright, or activities that people know connecting the community in America to Israel, come out of the Jewish Agency with funding from the WZO and the Karen Kayemet, and funds from around the world with the Karen HaYesod. So this may be sort of a lot of what people will call inside baseball, a lot of things that are not known to the general public, but it plays an important role in this body that literally was formed by Herzl in the same structure largely that exists today, that connects the Jewish world with through the Zionist movement with Israel. So just do that. I think that's the last slide of the presentation. Last week, the Zionist Congress met, and it met virtually. So it was not like a regular Zionist Congress in which one of the best things that happens is thousands of delegates and alternates from around the world coming together, meeting in the hallways, schmoozing, chatting with each other, right, left, religious, secular, from dozens of countries, but that element was lost very sadly and unfortunately. And there hopefully will be a Zionist Congress that meets next year, next fall, or sometime in 2022 is the plan for the Congress to meet, when people can have that interaction, get fired up. It's sort of like, as I mentioned, a political convention where the faithful come together and get fired up about Zionism. What was decided last week was the leadership of the Zionist movement, a few resolutions to guide policy, but most of the policy resolutions will be dealt with when the Congress meets in person. So what you may have seen was that, and I'll try to summarize it very briefly and neutrally, as we at AZM are the sort of the board of elections of the Zionist election in America, and the neutral body, including very diverse group of organizations. And I'll just note that many member organizations and synagogues that are part of the Westchester Jewish Council are also part of groups that are part of the Zionist movement. So most of the synagogues, the Orthodox synagogues, are part of Mizrahi, or Reform congregations are part of Artza, or the conservative movement congregations are part of Merkaz. So there's a direct connection between many of the groups that people are part of in Westchester and the Zionist institutions and the bodies that are there. So at the Congress last week, what was largely reported was that there was an effort by groups that were more on the center and right of the spectrum to, through an agreement, to sort of take control of the key positions in the Zionist movement. And traditionally, the Zionist movement is based on what's known as a wall-to-wall agreement, a coalition agreement. So unlike a parliamentary system, and this is different than what we're used to in America, but the Zionist Congress sort of operates on both a European and Israeli model. There's a coalition in Israeli politics, as we know. There's a coalition, a government, and an opposition. But in the Zionist movement, we don't want an opposition. We're one people, one movement. So there's no opposition. So therefore, there's always a wall-to-wall agreement where everybody comes together and all the portfolios and all the responsibilities are divided up, regardless of ideology or religious streams. However, being a political body, some people have more seats from around the world than others, and what seemed to happen was that the groups that were more on the right and Orthodox community were gaining the key positions, and the groups many in the diaspora, from the Reform, conservative, secular groups, and the groups on the center left, felt that they were being shut out of the key positions, while they had other positions in the agreement as proposed. They weren't getting the key positions. So there was a lot of uproar, a lot of coverage in the media. Many of the nonpartisan groups, such as Hadassah and Witzo and B'nai B'rith, weighed in, saying that they thought the coalition agreement should be altered and amended to be more inclusive and give more key roles to the non-Orthodox groups and the groups that were not just on the right end of the political spectrum. And so after 3 days of negotiations and elections that were supposed to take place on Tuesday and got postponed about 60 hours, and the Congress ending at 3 o'clock in the morning, East Coast. Alicia and I were watching live. I'm not sure who else was. There was a new agreement that was reached that, not everyone's a little bit unhappy and everyone's a bit happy. And you'll see the statements from everybody claiming that they got something important out of it, in that while many positions were allocated to groups on the right and center right, there were also significant positions allocated to groups that from the non-Orthodox communities, the conservative reform movements, and groups on the left and the center. So I can talk a little bit more during the Q&A about what that means on a practical basis. But given the collective spending of the Zionist movement is about $1 billion a year from the institutions that I mentioned. And that's a lot of money that gets spent on programs in Israel, on Aliyah, on Jewish education, on religious activities in Israel. So there's important decisions on where that money is spent within the Green Line, outside the Green Line, Orthodox communities, pluralistic communities, Reform, conservative communities, where it goes in the diaspora, what the priorities are. So the Zionist Congress doesn't vote on a line item budget, but elects the leadership who will set the direction for the movement. So it was felt that it was important by many that there be a broad coalition, and that's what was achieved at the end, that included all the voices at the table. So part two will continue when the Zionist Congress hopefully meets in person, sets policy resolutions. We'll see what happens over the course of the next year, because this is a situation like we've never had before. The Zionist Congress was only canceled twice since Herzl Day, both during the First and Second World Wars, and the movement felt it was important to keep going and not surrender to the virus, and keep it going and try to use the technology that we had that didn't exist in Herzl's age to get people to vote and to vote and participate. Let me finish with one thing. One of the proudest things that we saw from last week. A quarter of all the delegates are required to be youth. So, while maybe it seemed like a quota, there's a mandate that's existed for decades that a quarter of the delegates be youth. Actually, a third of the delegates have to be women as well. And women, just as an anecdote, voted in the Zionist movement in 1898 at the Second Zionist Congress. So the Zionist movement always says they were 20 years ahead of suffrage in America. But a quarter of the delegates were youth, and we put together through Alicia and Jeff a Zoom meetings and WhatsApp group that had a really vigorous chat going all week among young delegates who were from right to left, from groups that never would have talked to each other, that were engaging on WhatsApp. Then they said they wanted to have Zoom meetings so they could see each other, and kept a really good dialogue going. And they vehemently disagree on many things, religiously, ideologically, politically, but it was a chance. They were all elected to the Zionist Congress. They were largely first-time delegates. They were all excited about going, and they wanted to learn from each other, and they're keeping the dialogue going, and we're going to keep it going over the next couple of months. So that gives me great hope for the future of what we do to promote Zionism, that the young people from very diverse backgrounds wanted to connect and engage with each other. So I'll stop there and then be glad to take any questions, and hopefully give a little bit of insight into this, what is both a quaint and arcane structure, but has significant modern implications for how we connect Zionism and the Jewish people with Israel.
Well, that was fantastic. That was really fantastic. And I appreciate it. And I'm sure we all appreciate it. I'm going to kick things off as my right. I'll give you a kind of a two-piece question here, if you don't mind. First of all, what would you say, as I said at the very beginning, what would you say your sort of favorite or most memorable Israel or Zionist experience has been? And I'm sure you have many given your role. And then if you could pick one or two things that you see that could energize the Zionist movement, what might that be?
So in terms of, I know you sent me the question in advance. I couldn't even think of one moment. There were so many of them. From being in Israel during the Scud missiles, as we mentioned, I worked for assistant to the mayor of New York, and then Mayor David Dinkins, and we came with a solidarity mission of New Yorkers on an empty plane to visit Israel during the Scud missile crisis. So that was a powerful moment, connecting the largest community in America to Israel and showing solidarity. To recent trips when I've been with AZM, and we hosted delegations together with then Ambassador Danon, bringing diplomats from 67 countries to Israel, having come from Poland, from Auschwitz or Majdanek, to see firsthand the land of Israel. There's a line in the Talmud that Ein shmiya domeh l'riyah. Hearing is not like seeing. And one of the ambassadors from Nigeria said we have the same phrase in Nigeria and in his culture. And the ambassadors came away having seen what goes on in Israel firsthand with a new appreciation for the land. Two personal memories, in my family, when my father was buried on Har HaZeitim, and he had been a fighter in the Haganah in 47, 48, to just recently where my son became a lone soldier in the IDF, and seeing him in the modern uniform of the state of Israel. So there are many experiences and I can't even count how many trips to Israel. And I think everybody who's been to Israel has their own moments, maybe not just one of them, from setting foot or, even on the flight, seeing the land when you cross over, that really inspire us. And in terms of what I think needs to be done to move the Zionist movement forward, I think there are a couple of things. One, obviously, from combating the negative, which is fighting BDS, explain to people the importance of Zionism, what it is the liberation movement of the Jewish people, what Zionism means, about the Jewish people having their own homeland in our historical land and the modern democratic nation state of Israel, to the need for a civil discourse, to having a respectful dialogue. People can vehemently disagree on things, but we at AZM try to be the safe space, the table where people can sit, and we really will get people from every perspective coming to the table and talking. They may not agree, they leave the room, but they may have a greater understanding of each other's perspective, and toning down the rhetoric. Everything in our country and our world has become so political and so heated, and we need to keep that out of the Zionist movement. There are so many people attacking the state of Israel and its own existence that we really can't afford to be so divisive ourselves, when we need to still fend off the enemies, and the movements for delegitimization of Israel and countering BDS, which continue, are important for things for which we need to be unified. I would say two more things. One is education, Zionist education, getting people to learn about Israel early on, to visit Israel. Birthright trips and education on campus are great, but it really needs to begin before kids get to campus and start getting hit by the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist rhetoric, or coming to campus and being told that Zionism is racism, and if you're a Zionist, you're a racist colonial occupier. So that the education really needs to begin before. And again, I was inspired by the young people that participated in the Zionist Congress and who are fired up in their Zionism. And I think that gives hope for the future.
No, that's great. That's fantastic. Can you just tell everybody, when you say youth, what age bracket range is that for the organization?
So for the Zionist movement, officially it's 18 to 35. And obviously there are differences between 18-year-olds and
Sure.
Young professionals or people with young families. But a lot of the efforts, the Zionist AZM includes nine Zionist youth movements. The USY, NIFTY, NCSY, B'nai Akiva, Habonim Dror, Hashomer Tzair, BBYO, and others. The Tzofim, that and you can see the full list on our website, azm.org. But the nine Zionist youth movements deal with with kids at a younger age, and while the leadership may be older teens, they're dealing with thousands of kids every year in programs, the ones I mentioned, including Young Judea as well, who are teaching about Israel and Zionism, and so even the younger age is included, though the delegates formally started at age 18. And we had delegates ranging from 18 to 89 and coming from 28 states, DC and Puerto Rico. We had voters in the Zionist election from all 50 states and even American Samoa.
Fantastic, fantastic. And one other question for you. First of all, I violated my own rule, and then we're going to open it up. We've got some people asking questions, but I violated my own rule. So also have many favorite fundamental experiences, but I would say that taking my boys to Israel for the first time was my seminal moment, especially when one of my sons put his arm around me after Har Herzl and said, "I get it, Dad, I get it." That was a poignant moment. So one other quick question for you, and then I'm going to start opening it up to the crowd. You said a third of the delegates have to be women. Now, I'm sure that got a good response from many of the women in the group, but it made me wonder, is there a goal to get to 50%?
We had many more than, I think we had close to 50% of the delegates were actually, and the candidates were women.
Okay.
The Zionist movement decades ago set a minimum because they wanted to make sure that they were inclusive. And there are historic women's Zionist organizations that have always been in the Zionist movement, including Hadassah, Emunah, Amit, which was the women's Mizrahi originally, WITSO, the Women's International Zionist Organization, which operates somewhat in America, but around the world. And Na'amat, used to be known as the Pioneer Women, was the women's group of the labor Zionist movement. So the women leaders in the Zionist movement have been in the forefront even before Golda Meir.
Fantastic. I guess you would have just changed that regulation into 50% instead of a third, since you're already there. All right, one question from the audience, and then there are some folks who've raised their hand to ask directly, which I guess we can also do in unmuting. But the first is a Mark Baranek. What was the biggest surprise for you at the conference?
Again, the Congress itself was, the biggest surprise was the whole way that it happened, that it wasn't, that it got pulled off virtually, connecting people all around there. It was a combination of some pre-recorded sessions, some open dialogue, some Zoom meetings. So that the fact that we were able and again, we don't run the Congress, it's run by the WZO itself. But that, Americans across the country and people were getting up at 5 a.m. to participate, so that people in Moscow to New Zealand could also be on, and that it all worked was a bit of a surprise, a pleasant surprise. And I guess the other surprise was that there was such passion from groups wanting to have a seat at the table. And many of the groups that don't normally participate in the election process were weighing in. As I mentioned, some of the groups that are traditionally nonpartisan were weighing in, saying that they wanted to make sure the diaspora and the groups that were not on the right or non-Orthodox groups also had a seat at the table. So there's not usually as much contention, but I think that was also reflected passion, that people wanted to make sure that all the voices were represented in the movement. And in the end, I think that was largely achieved.
Right. Question from Shoshana Biederman. I'm going to unmute you, Shoshana. Oh, can I unmute you? I'm not able to do that. Maybe Helene or somebody can do that.
Hi, Danny. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Mr. Block. Hi, everybody. Shoshana Biederman, president of Students and Parents Against Campus Anti-Semitism. Mr. Block, this is just weigh in on this, the way we see things, being on the forefront of anti-Semitism on campus. When we're at Columbia during Apartheid Week, and SJP is standing with all the terrible, signs about Israel being an apartheid state and so forth, or at NYU when during Yom Ha'atzmaut, they burned the Israeli flag. And on the Zionist, among the Zionist students, you have Orthodox students, you have secular students, and they all come together because they have to, because the reality on campus is that, they're united and they're standing up against the anti-Semitism, against the anti-Zionism, and against all the lies about Israel. How can that inspire the adults in the room, if you will, to get along, to put away the strife, and to understand that here on the ground, our students are really facing difficult times on campuses. And the ones that are the incoming ones, the high school students, also have to know, if you will, that we're all behind them and we're united in helping them change, the reality on campus. And for that, you have to be united and you have to work together. And would that in any way, if they heard more from what is happening on campuses, would that change things?
So, Danny, if I may answer that, thank you, Shoshana. We know of your group, and I know you've connected with AZM in the past. So thank you. So there can't be enough efforts to work on campus fighting the BDS, the delegitimization of Israel, the resolutions like we just saw at Columbia, recently, which obviously it's not being implemented by the university leadership, but obviously they make a statement. There have been other successful efforts to beat back those attempts, but these efforts will likely continue. And it's not just about what goes on campus, but it's also about making sure that our young people and students it's not just fighting the resolutions themselves, which is important, but making sure that the Jewish students on campus and also the non-Jewish students have a positive image about Israel and the Jewish people. That what's positive about Zionism in the state of Israel and its accomplishments and its importance, and why we as the Jewish people are entitled to a homeland and a nation state of our own, and to combat misinformation about the state of Israel and what it does, which that information harms us, it harms the Jewish people, it harms our standing around the world. So for many reasons, the campus is a key battleground. I do think that oftentimes you will have people come together who might not otherwise different parts of the college campus, different religious groups and different ideological groups on campus. They will unite to fight these resolutions because they may disagree on a one-state solution or two-state solution, or where to daven at the Kotel, or funding of religious streams. But they will unite against the BDS attempt. So there were a number of resolutions making a priority, and several new departments created as a result of this agreement for youth movements, for a priority on Zionist education for those ages 18 to 25, and for strengthening the shlichim that come from Israel around the world. So we're just a few days after the Congress, and it's like, a new government getting set up, and it will take a little bit of time. But I think there was a very clear understanding of the priority. All the resolutions that came up, and they're including resolutions about anti-Zionism on campus, will be posted, and AZM has done a number of programs, and with the current chairman, newly elected chairman Yaakov Chagoel, forums on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And many people used to be able to try to separate or make a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I think there's pretty broad consensus now that anti-Zionism is a key part of the modern anti-Semitism, and that's something that we need to fight. The IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, includes anti-Zionism. It's something that even was just adopted in Bahrain last week as part of the new arrangements with some of those countries. So, Zionism is our middle name at the American Zionist movement, and many people are fighting anti-Semitism, but we, see it important to fight the anti-Zionism component of that.
Just mentioning Bahrain, one of the questions that I had also was if you could speak for a minute about some of the obviously very recent and exciting peace or normalization accords that have been penned and even rumored, and how you sort of see that fitting into the Zionist vision for Israel and the region.
Yes, and we've come a long way. I was a kid, I guess. I'll give my age away for those who can do the math. I think I was 12 when I watched, Sadat, having remembered the Yom Kippur War, and having our non-Jewish neighbor, miraculously turn on our TV on Shabbat so we could come home from shul and watch Sadat land in Jerusalem, which was an important Zionist moment that I vividly remember, even sitting in Manhattan, to seeing where we've come with some of these peace agreements and normalization of relations with important Arab and Muslim countries. So it's hard to imagine the progress that's been made, and it's a really welcome development. And there seems to be talk about more countries lining up, many of whom see, the new world order, the sharing of technology, the internet communications has brought people together in a way that it didn't before. I know people who have flown from Israel already to the UAE and have spoken about the warm relations that they get, and that obviously there are people in those countries and the leadership that are still concerned about the situation of the Palestinians and resolving that conflict. And that's an important thing that needs to be addressed, but it's not getting in the way of building the human contact that goes on. So I think that as these countries are engaging in normalization of relations with Israel, that it sends a message to people about the acceptance of Zionism, and if those countries can accept and have relations with the Zionist state of Israel, then it makes it more palatable for others to look favorably on the state of Israel. I'll note as an immediate Zionist AZM connection. One of our groups in America in AZM is Oav Etzion, the local branch of the World Sephardic Zionist organization. Rabbi Eli Abadi, who heads that, is a Manhattan rabbi and doctor, has just been named as the new, and he'll be moving to I believe to Dubai as the new resident, full-time resident rabbi of the UAE. So we have one of our own from the AZM family going to serve the Jewish community that's there, that's expected to includes some local Jews and other expats, and will include many Israelis now visiting and traveling and doing business.
Are there any Jewish organizations from any of those countries that are now members of, or might be members of, the World Zionist Organization? I guess.
So the WZO is sending a shaliach through to the UAE to begin to work with the Jewish community there. The Jewish community is largely expats, but even expats around the world are entitled to Zionist education. There's been a long Jewish community in Bahrain that's been there for hundreds of years, coming from many countries further away in Asia, but they've been there. There was a Jewish member of parliament. The Bahraini ambassador to Washington, D.C. for a number of years was a Jewish woman. So there's been a community there living quietly and peacefully. And so now that's going to all be expanded. And other countries, I saw Chabad announce that they're going to start sending shlichim to the countries that Israel has relations with now.
Another one from the group, and I think we may have, or you may have already touched on some of this, but let me ask it in fairness, and you can take the ball any way you want. But how can we, from Maria Brown, how can we educate students at all levels, our local communities in our country, of the importance of the Jewish people in the Zionist movement, and also of the Abraham Accord?
So the Abraham Accord, for those, is the term that that has been used about the new agreements. As you know, we are the Jewish people, the Muslim people are children of Abraham, so that's the term that's been used for these agreements. I think that again, it's all hands on deck in terms of the congregational education, the Zionist youth movements, the day schools, the summer camps, the informal education. There are a lot of opportunities to engage people online. We've had more people participating in our programs, youth programs, and otherwise than would be available for conferences and things in the last year. You know, things aren't free on Zoom, but more people can engage. Probably more people participating that might have come to a lunch and brought a brown bag meal to a lunch in Westchester today are on Zoom. So there's a lot of opportunities for broad education. I think these accords and these new agreements show Israel is taking its rightful place among the nations of the world. Israel is gaining more stature in the United Nations. So it's going to be a gradual process. It's not going to begin overnight. It's not going to turn around overnight. But I think there's some hope that that these developments all point in a positive trend for educating our Jewish community and the broader community about Israel. And I'll mention also, there are many, while they don't participate in the Zionist movement per se, because the Zionist movement created by Herzl is a Jewish movement. There are many friends and allies in the Christian community and groups that participate in activities as important allies and partners, and are important for the political support and the support that Israel receives in the global community, and that is that's a key part of efforts as well.
Well, I'm going to ask one last question on one thing that you and I touched on, which is the importance of Hebrew and people knowing Hebrew, learning Hebrew, exercising their Hebrew. Maybe you can talk for a moment. A, do you have any idea if those numbers are up or down or flat? And what is it that maybe the organization's doing and discussing apropos of a lot of the other questions we've had about, educating about Zionism? Hebrew is obviously such an important piece of that. I'll let you go ahead.
אני אדבר באנגלית, לא בעברית, על זה. One of the things that I'll give the answer in English, even though I should in Hebrew. One of the things that is very important and a unifying factor is Hebrew. And we've had classes this summer talking about online. We had hundreds of people, I think 600 people registered for a conversational Hebrew class. I don't even, they didn't matter what their religious or political backgrounds were. They were every kind of stripe of Jew you can have, who were on weekly Hebrew classes for 12 weeks this summer that AZM did with WZO. We just sold out a new Ulpan class yesterday. So there's a thirst for the Hebrew language. It's something not just important for our prayers, but really connecting people to the state of Israel. When you travel around the world, as you and I talked about before, when you go to Jewish communities in Argentina and South America, in South America, Mexico, South Africa, the community is much more fluent in Hebrew than we are in America. And, I think that's unfortunately a failing of the whole Zionist movement and the Jewish community in our country, that even kids coming out of day school and summer camps aren't as fluent in Hebrew, or the general population isn't as well. In our office, when we're actually in our office in Manhattan, there is based the Council for Hebrew Language and Culture, which is newly formed, and AZM is houses that together with the WZO to promote and coordinate different groups on promoting the Hebrew language. And there's information on that on our website. So there is going to be a greater commitment that came out of the Congress as well, and resolutions on that for greater funding for teaching Hebrew. Maybe new opportunities to do that online. You don't have to go to an Ulpan or a class. And I think that can be a unifying element of our movement. And Hebrew is is the Zionist language, in addition to being the liturgical language of the Jewish people and for our prayers every day on Shabbat. But it is very important and something that we're going to be working with everybody to promote.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Elliot Forsheimer now to conclude. But really, this was fantastic. I have to say, I personally got a lot out of this, and I consider myself reasonably well informed. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I really do want to thank you for giving your lunch hour. We do want to stay timely. And we want to thank Jeff, Alicia, and Herbert of AZM for kicking off what we hope will be a monthly series. Once a month will be the Israel Hour of the Council. If you read the news these days, Israel is not getting enough attention. There's so much historic, wonderful news happening. And we have, at least in some small way, we'll focus at least 1 hour on some of the developing stories using our varied and many council member organizations. I do want to thank you, Danny. Really nice job as your debut as the moderator. Maybe we'll have you back. It depends what the polls show. And if you want to reach, if you want to reach Herbert, for people to reach you.
My personal email is hblock@azm.org, hblock@azm.org. The main email for the organization is very easy, azm@azm.org. Our website is www.azm.org, and you can get a lot of information on our organizations, on the Zionist movement. Find my colleagues there as well, and we're happy to help work with any of your groups and promote our activities and your activities on Zionism. Thank you all.
That's great. And of course, thank you to the council staff, Helene, Donna, Pam, Lori, for all the work behind the scenes, getting this done. Stay tuned. We'll see you next month. We've got a really nice series planned. Have a great day. Stay dry, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Toda rabah.
Toda rabah.